Today we'll be painting over another one of my older sketches. This one is from my last sketchbook and you might recognize it from my sketchbook tour. I said I was going to go back to this one, so that's what I'm doing. Some of you may have already seen this video because I uploaded it yesterday and I am just redoing the voiceover. But yes, since this painting turned out to be pretty straightforward, I wanted to take this time to answer some of the most frequently asked questions I get about gouache. And the first one is, what is gouache? I always forget that just a few years ago I haven't even heard about gouache, so gouache is most commonly known as opaque watercolors. But from painting with them, you will learn that they are completely different mediums, and I've even found that a lot of artists who come from painting solely with watercolors will have problems getting used to the properties of gouache. And it's because watercolors are designed to be transparent, while gouache is the complete opposite. So people will use completely different techniques when approaching gouache and watercolors. And I also want to advise that if you're just starting out with the gouache, to not really compare it to watercolors at all. I even think that they're closer to acrylics than watercolors. It depends really on how you use them. But one very different thing from acrylics is that they can be reactivated even after they're dry. So it's a very delicate medium. You really have to have an order of consistency when you're working with them, in that you have to start with the most amount of water to little to no water at all. Because when you put looser paint over dried thick layers, you will end up reactivating those layers, so you really have to be careful with gouache. And then when you get enough practice and get used to water control, you will even eventually learn to glaze with gouache and not reactivate the layers underneath. But that is also something that not a lot of people do, and even I don't know how to do that fully yet. So gouache really requires practice and for you to get used to it before you can really start to enjoy painting with it. It's one of the hardest mediums to start with, I think. Next question I get is, are they that much different from acrylic gouache or acrylic gouache? And the answer is yes, they're completely different. I think it would also help that acrylic gouache is much closer to being acrylics than gouache. The only really main difference between the two is that acrylic gouache will have this beautiful matte finish that the colors will look the same way even when you look at it from different angles. It doesn't really have this glossy finish that most acrylic has, but that is one of their only differences. Acrylic gouache will dry permanently like acrylics do. They don't have that ability to be worked over again once they're dry, unlike regular gouache. The next question I get is, do I ever use a fixative when I'm painting over my sketches like these, and especially my pen sketches? And the short answer is I don't. I have tried using a fixative over my sketches and I found that I didn't really like the texture that I can get when there's the fixative on top of my paper. I just prefer to work straight on the paper, like what I'm doing right now. I even do this with freshly sketched sketches. I don't think that the ink will bleed that much. The biggest reason why is because when I'm working like this, I usually like to stay in the cream to butter consistencies, so there's not that much water in my paints. It's really just enough for the paint to be workable before I paint over my sketchbooks, and especially ones that aren't for wet media like this one. The next question I get is, how much water do I work with when I'm painting with gouache? And it's a good transition to my last question, in that there's two answers. The first one is when I'm working with sketchbooks like this where they're not really meant for watercolors, I would stay in the cream to butter consistency. And if you're wondering now what that is, Mary Sanch has a great video explaining the range of consistencies you can get with gouache depending on how much water you add to it. So it starts from tea which is mostly water with just a little bit of gouache, and all the way to butter, which is the gouache that's straight out of the tube, no water added to it. So usually when I'm doing the sketches like this, I don't add that much water, so just enough that the paint becomes workable for me and it doesn't drag on top of the paper. And then there are also times when I want to do a more finished piece. I usually use the full range from tea all the way down to butter. The next question I get is which kind of paper is the best for gouache? And once again, because I tend to make two kinds of gouache artworks, there are two answers. The first one, for when you're not using that much water, you can really use any paper. Most sketchbook papers will work great for gouache. So sketchbooks like this, the one I'm using right now is the Limelight sketchbook. I also use my Talon's sketchbook for my gouache pieces. But again, I don't use that much water for them, and that's because I can't. They don't really handle water that much. So for my fuller pieces, I would actually recommend watercolor paper that's not cotton. I think that's called cellulose. It's one of my recent discoveries that cotton paper won't really work that well for gouache, and that's because the cotton paper will adhere more to the gouache, so it will hold on to the paint more, and it will make it harder for when you want to go back to your pieces and rework them, because then they're just molded into the paper. And another thing, I don't really have any confirmation for this because I don't see anyone else mentioning it, so I might be wrong, but it does feel like the color shifting in gouache is much more apparent in cotton paper, and I think that's because the paint just sinks in faster on cotton paper, and so it's jarring when it happens and you don't have time to get used to it. With cellulose paper, it feels like a lot of the paint is just on top of the paper and not really just sinking into it really fast. So that's why I think cellulose paper is better for gouache, and what I recommend that I've tried is the Winsor & Newton Cotman smooth paper. And I think the Canson XL would also be great. I haven't really used it for gouache, but I have used it for watercolors, and I remember it has a lot of properties that remind me of the Winsor & Newton watercolor paper. So those two are great, but I also want to recommend sketchbook papers that are more versatile, because just because those papers I mentioned were great for gouache doesn't really make them the best for watercolors. So I think a more versatile sketchbook or paper is watercolor sketchbooks that are still cotton, because they are the best for watercolors, but also if they are very smooth and not that thick. So the first one I will recommend is the Etcher sketchbook, which I think is just the perfect actual sketchbook for painting and watercolors. And the second one is the SMLT Art watercolor sketchbooks. Even their cold pressed one is not that rough, and so it's just so great for watercolors, but then it's also good for gouache. So it's much more versatile if you're planning to work with both watercolors and gouache. The next question I get really often is which brushes do I use, and I'm not really that picky with gouache. I just need it to hold their shape really well and to give me enough control when I'm working with gouache. I think the best brushes for gouache are watercolor brushes that are synthetic. So things like the Giorgione brushes, that only are they great, but they're also so affordable. Another great one is the Mimiya watercolor brushes. I also think that their set is really nice and full and complete. They're also a great option. A newer discovery is the Etcher gouache brushes, which are specifically meant for gouache, and I've found them to be the softest gouache brushes that I'm mentioning today. They're really soft, but also they keep their shape really well. And the last question I want to go over is which is my most recommended gouache brand, and I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. I will first recommend the Holbein Artist's Gouache. They are so pigmented. They don't gray out that much because they're so pigmented. When I add a lot of colors to them, they feel the most like watercolors. That's how pigmented they are. Another one is the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache. I've only used 2 colors from them, but the ones I did use, I couldn't really tell apart from my Holbein gouache. But I have heard other people say that where they live, the Winsor & Newton is much more affordable, and where I live, I can get the Holbeins at a smaller price than the Winsor & Newton, so definitely just check out which one is more cost effective where you are. And then for more affordable options, I would honestly still say to get a smaller selection of colors from those brands, and especially if you're already used to color mixing, that is what's best. But if you're a beginner to color mixing, there's actually a brand that I just tried, and it's the Arctic's Gouache. I recommend those over the Himi gouache because the Himi gouache, out of all the gouache paints that I've tried, is the easiest to gray out. With the Arctic's one, doesn't gray out as much, and you also get a lot of paints and a lot of colors for not a lot of money. I've also been asked about the Talent Gouache. I've only tried the white from them, so I can't really say anything about the colors. But I have found that they don't really reactivate as creamy as the Holbeins or the Winsor & Newton gouache. That's the only thing I can say about them, but other than that, they're a new brand to me. So that is it for the most frequently asked questions I get about gouache. I hope I answered some of you guys' questions. If I haven't, make sure to leave them in the comments. I will try my best to answer them, but yeah, that will be it for this one. Thank you everybody for watching. Thank you to anyone else who saw this video already but is still watching. You guys are the best. Thank you to my patrons, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.